I didn't mean to bring Shadow home that day. A scarred, defiant stallion. They called him dangerous, cursed, even. But I saw something in his eyes: fear, pain, and a fight to survive. What I didn't know was that saving him would pull me into a dark world of secrets and danger. This isn't just a story. It's ours. A tale of trust, resilience, and redemption. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The midday sun beat down on the dusty auction grounds, its heat shimmering in waves off the metal railings. Horses shuffled nervously in their pens, their hooves kicking up small clouds of dry earth. It was a chaotic orchestra of whinnies, murmuring voices, and the sharp bark of the auctioneer's gavel. I hadn't planned to be here today. I was already stretched thin back at Haven Oaks Sanctuary, but something about this place always drew me in. Then I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the shadows played over his sleek black coat. But no, he was real. He stood apart from the others, his massive frame tense, almost trembling. A jagged scar ran just beneath his mane, like a deliberate brand, and his eyes, they weren't like the eyes of the other horses. They were dark, wild, and full of something I couldn't quite place. "Trouble," muttered a wiry man leaning against the rail next to me, his cigarette dangling from his lips. "That one's been through 5 owners in 2 years. Kicked one clean out of a trailer. Nobody wants him." I should have walked away. I should have listened to the warnings that flashed in my mind, telling me that Haven Oaks didn't have the resources for a horse like this. But as I stood there, watching him glare at anyone who dared approach, I couldn't shake the thought. He wasn't angry. He was terrified. "What's his name?" I asked. The man shrugged. "They call him Shadow. Fits, don't it? Dark as night, and just as mean." I folded my arms and leaned against the fence, pretending not to notice the auctioneer's sharp glare in our direction. The man next to me smirked. "You're not thinking of bidding, are you?" I didn't answer him. Instead, I just watched Shadow, my chest tightening. Beneath all that anger, I saw something else, something I'd seen in countless animals before him. Fear. And pain. "Do it," the man taunted, nudging me with his elbow. "Go on. Add him to your charity ranch. You're the only one crazy enough." I wasn't crazy. At least, I didn't think I was. But there was no denying the pull I felt. Shadow needed someone who wouldn't give up on him, someone willing to look past the scar and the rage. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted to be that person. When the auctioneer opened the bidding at a laughably low price, my hand shot up before I had time to second-guess myself. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Shadow stomped his hooves and tossed his head, his defiance palpable. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, his gavel striking the podium with finality. I was suddenly aware of the man next to me laughing. "You're in for it now, lady. That horse'll eat you alive." As the handler struggled to load Shadow into my trailer, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what I'd just done. Haven Oaks was already home to a dozen rescues, each with their own story of neglect, abuse, or abandonment. And now, I'd just taken on the biggest challenge of them all. Driving back to the sanctuary, the old trailer rattled and groaned as Shadow stomped and snorted inside. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting the door to burst open. "You sure about this one?" crackled Logan's voice over the CB radio. He was following in his truck, hauling supplies. "No," I admitted. "But I think he needs help. Whatever's going on with him, I want to figure it out." There was a long pause before Logan finally replied. "Just don't get yourself killed trying." That evening, when we pulled into the sanctuary, Shadow's arrival didn't go unnoticed. The other horses turned their heads, their ears swiveling toward the trailer. I backed it into place carefully, my heart pounding as I prepared to open the door. The second I unlatched it, Shadow thundered down the ramp, his hooves striking the ground like gunfire. He bolted to the farthest corner of the paddock, pacing with a nervous energy that made my chest ache. "You're safe now," I murmured, though I doubted he believed me. Logan leaned against a fence, his arms crossed. You got a soft spot for the broken ones, don't you? He's not broken, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. He's scared. Big difference. Logan didn't reply. He just shook his head, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. I stayed by the paddock long after the sun dipped below the horizon, watching Shadow pace beneath the dim light of the barn's floodlights. He stopped once, just for a moment, and looked straight at me. For the briefest second, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, but hope. It was all the encouragement I needed. The morning after Shadow arrived, I found myself leaning against the paddock fence, steaming mug of coffee in hand, watching him. He hadn't stopped pacing since he got here. His powerful legs churned up clouds of dust as he moved in restless, unpredictable patterns. Occasionally, he'd stop and glare at the world, ears pinned back, as though daring it to come closer. It was heartbreaking. The other horses kept their distance, their heads low as they watched him. They didn't whinny or stomp their hooves in greeting like they usually did with newcomers. They seemed to understand that Shadow wasn't like the others. He's not settling, Logan said from behind me, startling me. He leaned against the fence, his hat pulled low over his face. Not yet, I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Logan sighed. Amelia, I know you've got a thing for the tough cases, but this one, he trailed off, shaking his head. He's dangerous. He's scared, I said, setting my coffee down and turning to face him. And scared animals do dangerous things. That doesn't mean they're beyond saving. Logan stared at me for a long moment before pushing off the fence. Just be careful, he said as he walked away. I'd hate to see you get hurt over a lost cause. The next few days tested every ounce of patience I had. Shadow wouldn't let anyone near him. Every time I stepped into the paddock, he bolted to the farthest corner, his eyes wild and his body coiled like a spring. Even the slightest sound, a clink of a bucket, the snap of a twig, would send him into a frenzy. I spent hours sitting on an old stool by the fence, talking to him softly, reading aloud, or just humming. I didn't know if it made a difference, but it felt like the right thing to do. I told him stories about the other horses at the sanctuary, how Daisy, a retired racehorse, had learned to trust again after years of neglect. How Scout, a blind pony, had found his way with the help of his paddock mate, Blue. I don't know what happened to you, I murmured one evening, watching him pace under the glow of the barn lights. But whatever it was, you're not alone anymore. I'll help you if you let me. He didn't stop pacing, didn't even glance my way. But I noticed something, a slight flick of his ear toward my voice. It wasn't much, but it was something. A storm rolled in a week later. The wind howled through the paddock, bending the trees and sending loose strands of hay swirling into the air. I stayed late in the barn, my nerves on edge. The other horses huddled together in their stalls, their bodies calm and steady despite the chaos outside. Shadow, however, was another story. His movements were erratic, his pacing frantic. Every crack of thunder sent him bolting to the farthest corner of the paddock, his hooves churning up mud as he bucked and reared. Easy, boy, I called from the barn doorway, my voice barely audible over the storm. When a particularly loud crash of thunder shook the ground, Shadow let out a shrill whinny, his entire body trembling. My heart broke at the sight of him, so vulnerable and exposed. I grabbed a blanket and flashlight and stepped out into the rain. The cold rain soaked through my clothes as I approached the paddock. Shadow's ears swiveled toward me, his eyes wide and wild. It's okay, I said, my voice low and steady. I'm not going to hurt you. I stopped a few feet from the gate, holding the blanket out in front of me like a shield. Shadow's nostrils flared as he snorted, his muscles tense and ready to bolt. For a moment, I thought he would run again. But then, to my amazement, he stood still. He didn't relax, not fully, but he didn't run. You're okay? I whispered, inching closer. You're safe now. I draped the blanket over the gate and stepped back, giving him space. Shadow didn't move for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes locked on mine. Then, slowly, he lowered his head. It wasn't trust, Not yet, but it was something. And for the first time since he arrived, I felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of Shadow standing in the rain, his head bowed under the storm. It wasn't just fear I'd seen in his eyes. It was something deeper, like the weight of an invisible burden he couldn't escape. After the usual morning rounds, I decided to dig into his past. I grabbed the sparse paperwork that had come with him at the auction and spread it out on the kitchen table. Age, 7. Breed, thoroughbred. History, unknown. The words stared back at me like a taunt. Whoever had owned him before clearly didn't want anyone to know where he came from. I sighed and flipped open my laptop, logging into a forum I often use to connect with other rescuers. I posted a picture of Shadow, focusing on the scar beneath his mane and the thin, circular mark on his leg. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally typed. Does anyone recognize these scars? Could use help figuring out this horse's history. I hit submit and closed the laptop, not expecting much. Most of the time, posts like this went unanswered. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's scars held the key to his behavior. That evening, while cleaning out the barn, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a notification from the forum. My heart quickened as I opened the thread. There was one reply. The user had posted a link to an article about an illegal underground racing circuit that had been shut down years ago. Beneath it, they'd written, "That scar looks like the brand they used. These horses were treated horribly. If he has this mark, he's one of them." I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. Illegal racing circuits weren't just cruel, they were brutal. Horses were branded, tethered, and pushed to their breaking points, then discarded when they couldn't perform anymore. The faint scar circling Shadow's legs suddenly made sense. A tether pulled too tight. My hands trembled as I clicked the article, skimming over the details of races held in secret, horses whipped and drugged to win at any cost. The circuit had been shut down, but clearly, the damage it caused lived on in horses like Shadow. "What did they do to you?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. The next morning, I walked out to Shadow's paddock, my head buzzing with everything I'd read. Shadow was pacing again, his muscles rippling with tension. "I'm going to figure this out," I told him, gripping the fence. "I'll find out what happened, and I'll make it right." Later that day, I found an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. No return address, no postage. My throat tightened as I tore it open, my fingers trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words typed in bold letters. "Stop digging. Leave him." My breath caught. I spun around, scanning the empty yard. The ranch was quiet, the only sounds the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional snort from the horses. But someone had been here. My heart pounded as I reread the note. Whoever left it wasn't just warning me, they were threatening me. I clenched the paper in my hand and stormed into the barn, my fear quickly morphing into anger. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind had me sitting upright in bed. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I checked, there was nothing. As I paced the kitchen, my phone buzzed again. Another response on the forum. This time, it was worse. The user explained that the underground racing circuit wasn't as dismantled as the authorities claimed. Smaller operations were starting up again, using the same brutal tactics. Horses like Shadow were commodities, trained, raced, and discarded like garbage. The knot in my stomach tightened. The scars, the pacing, his fear of ropes, it all fit. Shadow wasn't just a victim of abuse. He was evidence of something much darker. The light above the paddock flicked on, triggered by the motion sensor. My heart leapt as I glanced out the window. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, but when I squinted into the darkness, there was nothing. Still, the fear lingered. Whoever left that note wasn't bluffing. The next morning, I found Logan fixing a broken fence near the barn. "Something's not right," I told him, holding out the note. He read it, his face darkening. "This from the people who dumped Shadow?" "Probably," I said, glancing toward the paddock where Shadow was standing still for once, his ears swiveling. He's connected to something bad, Logan. I can feel it. Logan rubbed the back of his neck, his expression uncertain. Amelia, you've got enough on your plate. You really want to go poking around in something like this? I met his gaze. I don't have a choice. If he's a piece of this, I have to protect him. And if it means exposing whoever's behind it, then that's what I'll do. He shook his head but didn't argue. Just don't do anything reckless, okay? I don't want to have to explain to the sheriff why my boss got herself killed. Deal, I said, though we both knew it wasn't a promise I could keep. The evening air was heavy as I stood by the barn, Shadow's halter gripped tightly in my hand. The plan was set. Laura, the detective I'd contacted after discovering Shadow's connection to the underground racing circuit, had arranged everything. Police officers were stationed nearby, hidden among the trees and brush surrounding Haven Oaks. All we had to do now was wait. Shadow snorted softly, shifting his weight nervously. I stroked his mane, murmuring reassurances I wasn't sure even I believed. It's almost over, boy, I whispered. We're going to make sure they never hurt you or any horse again. My voice trembled as I spoke. The threats, the tracker, the movement I'd caught glimpses of in the shadows, it all culminated in this moment. Tonight, we were luring them out. The men who wanted Shadow wouldn't be able to resist the bait, a seemingly vulnerable horse in an unguarded paddock. The clock ticked past midnight when the first sound reached me. It was faint, a car engine, idling in the distance. My heart thudded as I tightened my grip on the flashlight in my pocket. Then I saw them. Headlights cut through the darkness as a black SUV pulled into the yard. The vehicle rolled to a stop, and two men stepped out, their silhouettes tall and broad against the dim glow of the floodlights. I ducked into the barn, my pulse racing. Through the slats of the wooden wall, I watched as they moved with practiced precision. One carried bolt cutters, the other a coiled lead rope. Stay calm. Laura's voice crackled softly through my earpiece. I forced myself to breathe, my eyes fixed on Shadow. He stood in the paddock, his ears twitching nervously. When the men approached the gate, he let out a sharp whinny, his hooves stomping the ground. That's far enough, I said, stepping out of the shadows, shotgun in hand. The men froze, then turned to face me. Lady, don't make this harder than it has to be, one of them growled, his voice cold and sharp. You're trespassing, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. And you're not taking him anywhere. The second man smirked. You think you can stop us? You're out of your league. Maybe I was. But I wasn't alone. As if on cue, the flash of red and blue lights lit up the yard. Police vehicles roared into view, surrounding the paddock. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, their voices sharp and commanding. Hands in the air. Get down on the ground. The smirk on the man's face vanished as he dropped the bolt cutters. Both men raised their hands, their movements slow and deliberate. I exhaled a shaky breath, lowering the shotgun as officers moved in to cuff them. Hours later, the scene was quieter, but no less surreal. Laura walked up to me, her expression a mix of relief and determination. You did it, she said, her voice softer than I'd expected. No, I replied, glancing toward the paddock where Shadow stood, watching the commotion with wary eyes. He did. Laura handed me a stack of papers, documents retrieved from the men's SUV. You were right, she said. This is big. These aren't just hired hands, they're connected to a larger network. Records, photos, financial ledgers, it's all here. Enough to dismantle the operation for good. The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd thought I was just saving a single horse. But Shadow's story was bigger than I'd ever imagined. I spent the rest of the night sitting by Shadow's paddock, watching as the sun began to rise. He grazed quietly, his movements calm for the first time since he'd arrived at Haven Oaks. You did it, I said softly, my voice carrying in the stillness of the morning. You showed them you're more than what they made you. Shadow lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting mine. For a moment, I thought I saw something there, trust, maybe even gratitude. It was enough to remind me why I'd fought so hard to protect him. The following weeks brought a strange quiet to Haven Oaks, though the air still buzzed with the aftermath of what had happened. The arrests had sent shockwaves through the small town, and the evidence uncovered in the SUV linked Shadow's captors to a larger operation than anyone had imagined. Laura and her team worked tirelessly, dismantling what remained of the underground racing circuit. But here at the sanctuary, the focus was on healing. Shadow's transformation was slow but profound. For days after the raid, he stayed in his corner of the paddock, his dark eyes scanning the horizon as if he were still expecting someone to come for him. I didn't push him. Instead, I spent my time sitting near the fence, reading aloud or simply being there. "Patience," I murmured one afternoon as I leaned against the paddock gate, a brush in hand. "That's the only way this works, isn't it?" Shadow flicked his ears toward my voice but didn't approach. It wasn't until the third week that he finally made the first move. I was brushing Daisy, one of the older horses, when I noticed him standing closer to the fence than usual. His gaze was fixed on the brush in my hand, his body tense but unmoving. "You want to turn?" I asked softly, setting the brush down and stepping back. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, cautiously, he stepped closer, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. My heart swelled as he stretched his neck toward the brush. "That's it," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. "You're safe now." The days that followed were filled with small victories. Shadow allowed me to brush his coat, his muscles trembling under the light pressure, but never pulling away. He let me lead him out of the paddock for short walks, his steps hesitant but deliberate. Every inch of progress felt like a triumph. Logan watched from a distance, his skepticism slowly melting into something resembling pride. "Guess I was wrong about him," he admitted one afternoon as he leaned against the fence. I smiled. "He's not the only one who's changed." Logan chuckled. "Fair enough." The first time I saddled Shadow was a moment I'll never forget. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the fields as I led him out of the barn. He stood still as I tightened the straps, his ears swiveling nervously, but never pinning back. "It's okay," I said, stroking his neck. "We're just going to take it slow." I swung into the saddle, my heart pounding. Shadow tensed beneath me, his muscles coiling like springs. For a moment I thought he might bolt. But then, with a gentle nudge, he took his first step. It wasn't perfect, his gait was uneven, his movements hesitant, but it was progress. As we rode across the pasture, I felt a wave of pride and gratitude wash over me. This horse, once labeled dangerous and cursed, was now trusting me to guide him. Later that evening, I sat by the paddock, watching Shadow graze under the fading light. His scars were still visible, faint lines etched into his black coat, but they no longer defined him. "You've come a long way," I said softly, resting my chin on my knees. "I thought I was saving you, but the truth is you saved me." Shadow lifted his head, his ears twitching in my direction. It felt like he understood. The lesson wasn't lost on me. For so long, I'd carried the weight of past failures, rescues that hadn't made it, mistakes that had cost lives. Shadow taught me that healing doesn't come all at once. It's a process, a journey made of small steps and quiet victories. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood and leaned against the paddock gate. "You were never doomed, Shadow," I whispered, my voice catching. "You were just waiting for someone to believe in you." He turned toward me, his dark eyes soft in the dim light. For the first time, he looked at peace,